I'm thinking today about leadership, and particularly the times in our leadership when it's small acts of humility and repentance that go unnoticed maybe. They don't grab the headlines, they don't hog the limelight, but it's these small acts multiplied many times over at particularly the grassroots level of society that actually changes nations. I saw this demonstrated in South Africa in the middle of 2008. It was the height of the global crisis. And in May 2008, there was a series of xenophobic attacks against Africans of a non-South African descent. And in the space of a few days, there was around 70 people killed and many hundreds more injured, people from neighbouring nations like Malawi and Mozambique and Zimbabwe. And thousands of terrified Africans fled their homes in the townships and sought sanctuary in safer places, in churches and outside police stations. And quickly, overnight, large camps were springing up of these displaced people. And one of these camps started in an area called Soetwater, which is on the Atlantic coast, close to where we lived in Cape Town. So myself and several others from our team and friends from church got involved as volunteers in the camp. In those early days in the camp, it was actually pretty manic. Hundreds of scared Africans were arriving with all that they could carry in their hands, coming in by bus, some of them arriving on foot, some of them brought by police vans. It was May, this is the height of the Cape autumn. Winter was coming and the Atlantic wind was blowing in from the coast. It was often raining. It was a terrible place to build a campsite. We were setting up tents in the rain. Very quickly, streams of water were running down the road. The walkways were becoming wet and muddy. The toilets, which were portaloos that had been brought in, were becoming unhygienic. It was cold, it was wet, the tents were leaking, children were crying incessantly from the cold. I can remember standing in a line with volunteers behind a trestle table, handing out cold food to hundreds of people standing patiently in a line. At that point, there wasn't enough power to run a kitchen, a mobile kitchen or something, to heat up food for all these people. It was a miserable kind of time. And then one day, maybe 3 or 4 days into the crisis, I remember there was a buzz of activity. Suddenly, loud police cars were arriving, sirens blazing. And then they were followed by a convoy of large black four-wheel drive vehicles with blackened windows, and large burly security bodyguards got off. And they were followed by the Western Province Premier. He was going to give a speech to the refugees. He came in with this aura of power, this mystique of leadership around him. The refugees gathered in a large group outside the main food marquee. And he began to speak to them. He didn't speak for long. He didn't take questions in that large group. He gave a lot of promises. He promised hot food, a mobile kitchen, more toilets, blankets, and he promised that they would find a long-term solution. He promised that the UNHCR would come in, would send representatives in to assess those people who are wanting to seek asylum in another country. And there were some people who were asking for that. He gave a lot of promises. It was interesting actually that as he began to speak, suddenly from nowhere, lots of press photographers were appearing and they were all recording his talk for the evening news, presumably. After a short while, he finished speaking and he moved off to the side, and he was followed by a small group of mainly men, quite loud and boisterous, wanting to question him. They sat down on the grass, maybe 50 metres away, and most of the press followed him. I followed them as well. Like them, I thought this was the main story. I was intrigued by this leader. I was intrigued by his leadership style, the way he addressed the group. He was a strong man. He was followed by a very different scene. A small group of maybe 8 or 10 people got up and stood in front of the main group of refugees. They stood there quietly and humbly. Most of the press didn't notice this happening at the time because they were following the Premier. But I had kind of half an eye on what was going on. I was listening with one ear to the main group and with the other ear to the Premier. I realised that this group was a group of community leaders from the local township, Masiphumelele. They were a delegation, and they'd come representing the community, and they'd come to make a public apology. They quietly and humbly read this out to the refugees. They repented for what had happened. They said it wasn't in the spirit of ubuntu, togetherness, African hospitality. They repented for this. They asked for forgiveness. They said that they had sought out and tried to return all the looted goods in their township. And they asked the Africans to return to their homes and promised them that they would keep them safe. It was interesting hearing this. Meanwhile, the Premier was finishing up with his group, and there was another buzz of activity as he left, with all the vehicles and the police cars and the sirens blazing. In the week to come, I didn't see any of the Premier's promises being fulfilled. But what we did see was an increasing number of Africans within the camp were leaving and returning to their homes in Masiphumelele. And over the next week, whilst a lot of people stayed in the camp, they were mostly people from other parts of the city. Most of the Africans from Masiphumelele had returned to their homes. Fascinating. And as I reflected on this over the coming days, I was left questioning where the real leadership in this crisis had come from. There was one form of, let me call it, alpha male leadership, which was upfront. It was big on sound bites. It was powerful. It was visible. It made a lot of promises, but there was very little follow through. By contrast, the other form of leadership was quiet. It was humble. It was community led. It publicly sought reconciliation. It owned what had happened. It took responsibility. It said, we have let you down. We have not shown you hospitality. You fought on our side against apartheid in the decades past, and this is how we have repaid you. Please forgive us. Incredible message they brought. That leadership wasn't top down. It was grassroots. It was from the bottom up. It often goes unnoticed. It's a little bit like yeast, quietly, silently working its magic in the dough. And it's truly transformational, whether it's noticed or not. This really left me reflecting on leadership. And even now, as I'm reflecting in the middle of this coronavirus and the lockdown, I'm so aware of the different types of leadership that we see. There's a lot of loud, brash, alpha male leadership in the world today, particularly in the political arena. This morning we were actually praying for our leaders together as a family, and little Manu, she's 12 years old, she prayed, Lord, help our leaders make decisions, not just thinking about what people think of them. Help them do the right thing. Help them to be more like that lady in New Zealand. Wow. She had picked up something from the ego that we see in politics, which is with an obsession for image. She'd picked up on something on the lack of character in leaders, but she'd also noticed something in Jacinda Ardern, the leader in New Zealand. Maybe it's the compassionate empathy she shows. Maybe it's the way she speaks to children and to adults. Maybe it's her clear, kind communication. Maybe she's noticed other loud alpha males continually belittling other people, pulling them down, lying, changing their opinions, making erratic decisions without clear, kind communication. I think it's fascinating that a child can intuitively see what is good and bad leadership in the adults around them. Fascinating. So as I'm thinking about all of these things, I also reflect back on many times in my years living and working in African contexts where, as a British person, I've had to recognise and own some of the things that my culture has done in Africa over many centuries. And there are many things which need to be repented for. And there have been many occasions when I've stood in front of groups and I've identified with the sins of my fathers. I identified with things that have happened in the past, and I've apologised. And I've said, forgive me on behalf of my nation. Please forgive Britain for what we've done in the past. And I'm always amazed, actually, at the impact humble identifying with what we have done to you, that humble approach brings. I think, to be honest, for many years, I've seen a certain form of leadership. And again, I'll call it that alpha male leadership, whether it's in the church or in mission or particularly in politics. I've seen the kind of the winner takes all mentality. I've seen the obsession, the ego. I've seen the weaknesses and the flaws. And I realise about myself, it's very, very easy for me to be critical. It's very easy for me to see the character weaknesses in other people. Several years ago, I was in a leadership development course. I think it was 2014. And it was a time for me of real self-reflection, recognising things about myself, recognising that I had very strong ideals on what I felt leadership should look like or could look like. I had a very, very strong aversion to certain types of leadership. And I realised that this easily led me to being critical. It easily led me to seeing what I didn't like and reacting against it. It led to pride. But I realised as well, which I don't think I'd faced up to that point, I realised as well that it also could lead to apathy. I didn't want to lead in the way that other people were, and so I was actually abdicating responsibility to lead. I was holding back from leadership, partly from a kind of a British sense of reserve and not wanting to push myself forward. Who am I to think I can do something else? And so I hold back. But also it was coming from a sort of a sense of false pride. I don't want to lead like them, and so I won't do it at all. And so it led to criticism, apathy, and abdication. And during that time, that season, as I reflected on these things, I recognised that was something that I wanted to change. I needed that to change. And so there was a point when, in front of a whole group of people, we verbalised different declarations of what God was doing in my life. And in that point, I said some things as I stepped over a line. And I said, I'm leaving behind that critical, reserved spirit which abdicates responsibility and doesn't take leadership. And I'm stepping forward. And in the future, I'm going to make myself available for leadership. But I want to lead in a different way. Interestingly, within 3 or 4 days of that declaration, the course was finished and I was back in my team and I'd been invited to join the leadership team. And suddenly my words were coming to pass. I'd made myself available and now I was in a leadership team. And the question was, how now will I live? How now will I lead? At the time I was reading Tony Stoltzfus's book, The Calling Journey. He writes in that the crux of your calling is to be Jesus in a unique way. He says that our call is to embody a unique facet of Christ's character through the channel of your role or task. So if my life is my message, if I am influencing through my life, and all that leadership really is influence, so I'm leading through my life, I'm influencing through my life, my character matters. And leadership is not a win at all costs. It's not alpha male. It's not the roar of the lion. It's interesting that Jesus is the lion and the lamb. He is Lord and servant. And if anything exemplifies Jesus' leadership more than anything else, it's the servant leadership. It's the being willing to lay down his life. It's the towel and the basin washing the disciples' feet. And as I think about all these things, I suppose I identify the towel and the basin with that humility of the Masipumaleli delegation, a willingness to identify with the sins of other people. It's not them, they haven't done it, but they're identifying with it and saying, we as a community want to do it differently. And so the challenge for me is, am I willing to lead carrying a towel and a basin of water? Am I willing to wash people's feet? Am I willing to apologise? Am I willing to lead from a place of humility, not from an ego or an arrogance? And this kind of leadership may not succeed very well in the political arena. It may not be rewarded. And right now our political systems are so in need of reformation, so consumed by a winner-takes-all obsession, not concerned much with character. But what the world is crying out for right now, surely, is a different kind of leadership. A leadership of kind, clear communication. A leadership of servant leadership, carrying the towel and the basin of water. That kind of leadership may not be rewarded. It may go unnoticed. It may slip under the radar, unseen. But it is seen by our children. It's seen by the next generation. And as that is multiplied thousands and thousands of times over by people of character at grassroots level, that is how our societies are truly transformed.